Welcome to my macroeconomics class. Today we are looking at international linkages. So the idea is that we've been studying a closed economy and looking at domestic absorption. But today we are opening up the economy and allowing our economy to be linked to other economies. So how are we linked to other economies? So we're linked to other economies through trade and also through finance. So we are going to start with the trade aspect. So the idea is that part of the output we produce is sold or is bought by people in foreign countries, and part of the output we consume is produced by people from the foreign country. So at the end of the day, we are linked through trade. So in our model, when we look at spending, we're going to say aggregate demand is equal to consumption plus investment plus government. So this is domestic absorption plus net exports. Plus net exports. So net exports here is effectively telling us that we are linked to the rest of the world. We are trading with the rest of the world. Now for us to effectively look at international linkages through trade, we'll have to look at the real exchange rate. So real exchange rate we are saying, if we call it R, is equal to nominal exchange rate, and then here we have foreign price level, and here domestic price level. So this is foreign price level. So this is nothing but the ratio of foreign price to domestic prices. That's the idea. So this is the ratio of foreign to domestic prices, and they are measured in the same units. Why? Because these foreign prices, when you multiply them with nominal exchange rate, they've effectively been converted to equivalent in domestic prices, the equivalent of domestic prices. So this is like foreign prices in kwacha over domestic prices in kwacha. Now, the idea is that when you look at this real exchange rate, it's looking at the valuation of foreign produced goods relative to the valuation of our domestic home produced goods. So now, when does R rise? So if R rises, it means that foreign prices are rising. So it means that foreign produced goods are becoming more expensive when compared to domestic produced goods. If such a scenario happens where foreign produced goods are becoming more expensive compared to domestic goods, the R will rise, and it is termed as a real depreciation. So a real depreciation we are saying foreign produced goods are relatively expensive. So we are saying a real depreciation, foreign produced goods are relatively more expensive when compared to home produced goods. So when you have a real depreciation, what is happening? So demand switches. So it will lead to demand switching. From produced goods to home produced goods. So demand will switch from foreign produced goods to home produced goods, because now the economies are open. You are free to buy goods from any country. So at the end of the day, the idea is that you buy from countries, goods whose goods are cheaper. So you buy goods from countries whose goods are relatively cheaper. That's the idea. So a real depreciation leads to demand switching from foreign produced goods to home produced goods. So when this R arises on the basis of how we've defined it, we will have a real depreciation. That's the idea. But this R can fall. What will cause the R to fall? So we are assuming that the nominal exchange rate is not changing. What can only change is the foreign price relative to domestic price. So for R to decrease, what is happening? For R to decrease. So if R decreases, it means that this domestic price is rising. If R decreases, it means the domestic price is rising. So if R decreases, it means that home produced goods are rising relative to foreign produced goods. So that is termed as a real appreciation. So a real appreciation, home produced goods. Home produced goods are expensive relative to foreign produced goods. Are relatively expensive relative to foreign produced goods. Relative to foreign produced goods. So now what will happen? This will lead to demand switching. From home produced goods to foreign produced goods. So what we're saying is that when price on home produced goods is rising, it will have the effect of reducing R. So if home produced goods are becoming more expensive relative to foreign produced goods, demand will switch away from home produced goods to foreign produced goods. So demand for foreign produced goods will increase. So a real appreciation leads to demand switching towards foreign produced goods away from home produced goods. That's the idea. That is the idea. Now, in this specification we've given here, we have aggregate demand, and this part here, we are calling it absorption, because that was the spending associated with a closed economy. That was the spending associated with a closed economy, domestic absorption. We're calling it A. And so if this component of spending, what is it? Absorption. This is domestic spending. Think of it this way. If we produce goods and there's no one else that's buying the goods from the foreign economy, what would be the components of spending driving our production? Absorption. That's the idea. And the idea is that if absorption is relatively large, the economy tends to be more resilient. But if absorption is small, the economy will be less resilient. That's the idea. So now these components, which we are referring to jointly as absorption, we mentioned to say that what determines absorption is income and interest rate. So we are having a scenario where we're talking about domestic spending. So we know that domestic spending, which we are calling absorption, depends on income and interest rate. Absorption depends on income and interest rate. Now we are saying plus net export. If you look at this total spending, we're saying absorption or domestic spending plus net exports. So when you look at A, the absorption, this is domestic spending, and you are looking at spending made by domestic factors, consumption, investment, and government. And then now we are recognizing that when you open the economy, you have what is known as domestic spending on domestic goods. So this, in other words, is domestic spending. This is domestic spending or absorption. And then this together is spending on domestic goods. Spending on domestic goods. That's the idea. Spending on domestic goods. So now what do you notice? So these are not the same concepts. Now we are recognizing that with an open economy, not all the output we produce we spend on ourselves, but part of the spending comes from the foreign economy. So when you look at spending on domestic goods, it's a much wider concept. But what you get to realize that even when you're looking at spending on domestic economy, for your economy to be much more resilient, you actually need a significant amount of absorption. A significant amount of absorption. That is really important, because if you're spending on domestic goods, really depends on so much how much people from other economies are buying, then shock to their economic system will have a big impact on your output. It will have a big impact on your output. But if domestic absorption is relatively big and resilient, then even if there's a shock on the net exports, you can be able to sustain your growth quite well. That's the idea. Come to think about it, we are living in a period where there's COVID. And what we noticed is that COVID has directly affected net exports, how much economies are able to buy, because they've gone on lockdowns. So it means that if net exports is badly affected and the domestic spending is quite low, then the economic growth may be affected badly. But if domestic spending is relatively large, then even in the absence of a shock, the economy can be able to have some growth of some sort, because domestic spending is able to finance production. So now, when you look at this idea, where spending on domestic goods is recognizing that not all the output you produce, you consume yourself. Part of it is consumed by people from other economies. Now, we already mentioned to say factors that affect domestic spending. Remember, we studied aggregate demand for a closed economy, and we found that income positively affects aggregate demand and interest rates negatively affects aggregate demand. What about net exports? What are the factors that affect net exports? So that's what we want to look at now. What are the factors that affect net exports? Net exports is sometimes referred to as current account or trade position of a country, trade balance. Trade balance. So, when we try to look at factors that affect net exports, so we're saying net exports is the difference between exports and imports. So now, if we want to know the factors that affect net exports, then we have to know the factors that affect exports and the factors that affect imports. So now, what we're saying is that when you consider export demand, exports, these are goods that we sell to other countries. So now, when you consider exports, who buys the exports? It's people in foreign countries. So what factor may affect how much they buy? One of the factors is foreign incomes, their income level. So if foreign incomes are higher, they'll buy more of our exported goods, and if foreign incomes are lower, they'll buy less. Then another factor which affects exports is real exchange rate. So if you are having a real depreciation, what will happen to exports? So the idea is that real depreciation, our goods, the prices are relatively cheaper compared to foreign produced goods. So what is the idea? Demand switches away from foreign produced goods to home produced goods. So we are likely to see an increase in exports. But a real appreciation, home produced goods are more expensive relative to foreign produced goods. So we are likely to see a decrease in real exports. So real exchange rate affects exports. What about import? What are the factors that affect import? Who imports goods? It's people in our economy who import goods. So what factor will affect how much they import? Domestic income. So Y is domestic income, YF is foreign income. So in this instance, import demand will be affected by domestic income. So when domestic incomes high, import demand will rise. But when domestic incomes are low, import demand will be lower. It will be lower. That's the idea. How about the other factor which affects import demand? We're assuming real exchange rate. Real exchange rate. So when you look at real exchange rate, how does it impact import demand? If you're having a real appreciation, foreign produced goods are cheaper than home produced goods. So what will happen? Demand will switch away from home produced goods to foreign produced goods. So import demand is likely to rise. But if you're having a real depreciation, what is the idea? foreign produced goods are more expensive compared to home produced goods. So demand will switch to home produced goods and import demand will decrease. So what are we seeing? What we are seeing is that factors that affect net exports, there's foreign income, real exchange rate, domestic income, and the real exchange rate. So the factors that affect net exports or the trade position of a country, there's foreign income, domestic income, and real exchange rate. That's the idea. Now, what would be the impact of a rise in foreign income on trade position of a country? For instance, if foreign incomes increase, what would be the impact on the trade position of a country? Yeah. So now we want to look at the impact of foreign incomes on the trade position of a country, the net export. What is likely to happen to net export when foreign incomes increase, when domestic incomes increase, and when there's a real exchange rate depreciation. So now, when domestic incomes increase, it will improve export demand because we are seeing that exports depend on foreign incomes. But import demand will remain unchanged because when foreign incomes increase, we are assuming that import demand remains unchanged. Everything else held constant in the short run, ceteris paribus assumption. So an improvement in foreign incomes will improve net export. What do we mean? Export demand will rise, but import demand remains unchanged. So its effect will be to improve the net export position, or the trade position of a country will improve when foreign incomes increase. What would be the impact of domestic incomes rising? So the impact of domestic incomes rising on the trade position of a country is that export demand will remain unchanged, but import demand will increase. So therefore, the trade position of a country will tend to worsen. The trade position of a country will worsen when domestic incomes increase. Everything else held constant. What about a real depreciation? What will be its impact on net exports or trade position of a country? So when you think about a real depreciation, think what it means. So a real depreciation means home produced goods are cheaper compared to foreign produced goods. So what happens? Demand switches to home produced goods. So export demand is likely to increase, import demand is likely to decrease. So a real depreciation it will translate into an improved net export position, or balance of trade position will improve. That's the idea. Of course, we are making assumptions that your export capability is able to react to sudden changes in demand. That's the assumption we're making. So now, how then does this net export affect the IS curve? Remember, we're talking about the IS curve. So in the IS curve, we said we have equilibrium in the IS curve when output is equal to aggregate demand. But now we are saying when output is equal to spending on domestic goods. So spending on domestic goods is a scenario where you have A, which is domestic absorption, plus net exports, which depends on foreign incomes, domestic incomes, and real exchange rate. So this is now the equation of the IS curve, where we're saying equilibrium is given by output being equal to domestic absorption plus the trade position of a country. So now what gets to happen when the trade position of a country improves or worsen, what will be the impact on the IS curve? So here you've got interest rate, and here you've got output, and you've got the IS curve. So now what we're saying is that, and we also have the LM curve. When the trade position of a country improves, IS curve shifts to the right. So whatever factor leads to an improvement in the trade position of the country, it will have the impact of shifting IS curve to the right. Why? Because the spending on domestic goods will increase when the trade position is improving. But suppose we're talking about improvement in trade position. That's the fact that's responsible to shift this. But if there's a deterioration in the trade position of a country, the IS curve will shift to the left. That's the idea. So what we are seeing is that an improvement in trade position of the country is expected to raise output and also raise interest rate. That's the idea. So it's supposed to lead to a position where both output and interest rates increase. Why? Because spending on domestic goods has risen. Spending on domestic goods, which is this. So when there's an improvement in the trade position, it implies that spending on domestic goods is rising and the IS curve shifts to the right. But if there's a deterioration in the trade position of a country, spending on domestic goods is decreasing and the IS curve will shift to the left. That is the idea. So what we are seeing is that the net exports has that effect. Now, one thing that we need to emphasize here is that when countries are internationally linked, when there's a real exchange rate movement, for instance, you have a real depreciation, what it does is that it switches demand. So it means that when you have a real depreciation, by implication, it means that your home produced goods are becoming cheaper compared to foreign produced goods. So what will happen to demand? Demand will switch away from foreign produced goods to home produced goods. So what does it mean? It means that employment and output in your domestic economy will rise, but employment and output in the foreign economy will decrease. So a real exchange rate movement has implication in terms of demand switching and issues of employment prospects and output prospects in those two countries. They literally switch. But that's the idea. So you find that if demand is switching towards your goods, your output will increase, your employment will increase, but the output in the foreign country will decrease and their employment will decrease. So a real exchange rate movement implies that one country will be gaining at the direct expense of the other country. That's the implication. But when countries are linked and you engage in expansionary fiscal policy, for instance, what that implies is that expansionary fiscal policy is going to increase domestic incomes and outputs, domestic employment. And when domestic incomes are higher, what that means is that now you import more goods. Your demand for foreign produced goods will rise, so your import will rise, and that will tend to raise production in the foreign economy. Of course, that's an assumption that your economy is relatively large. So in that instance, an expansionary fiscal policy will not only expand your output, but it will also tend to expand output in the foreign economy. And when output and incomes in the foreign economy increases, they will also increase how much they are demanding from your country, so that their import demand will rise, meaning your exports rise. So an expansionary fiscal policy has the capacity to literally raise output and employment to all countries you trade with, assuming that your economy is relatively large. If your economy is relatively small, they may not feel the impact of your expansionary fiscal policy. Yes, there might be an increase in demand for import demand, but it may not be enough to raise their output because their economy is too big. But if our economy is too big relative to the size of other economies, then an expansionary fiscal policy will literally raise output in virtually all other economies we deal with, whom we are internationally linked. So for instance, countries like the US, their economy is relatively large, so when they're undertaking an expansionary fiscal policy, it has the capacity to expand output in the Eurozone area, China, and everywhere else. The countries that are well linked with the US economy. That's the idea. So now, having said these words, we come to the end of the international linkages. So from here, we'll be talking about balance of payment. Thank you very much for being with me.